So in Chapter 3 of Informing with the Case Method, we take our first look at some principles of designing cases. So this particular chapter is going to focus mainly on the type of case that we're deciding to write and what objectives it has. We'll begin by talking briefly about the life cycle of a typical case. Then we'll move on to look at a number of different types of cases, such as research cases, discussion cases, and illustration cases. We'll move on to talk about the possibility of repurposing a case study, which is simply using a case study for a purpose such as research for which it was not originally intended. So if we think about a case study as having a life, case studies, like most documents, have a particular life cycle, and the first part of that life cycle is sort of designing the case. In other words, deciding what it is that we want to accomplish. Then we move on to actually doing the research of the case. We write the case, and then finally we use the case, which is where the case is employed in the classroom or where it diffuses to individuals aside from its original writing. So this particular life cycle is nothing special. In fact, most research and even teaching tools could in fact be described like this. And in this chapter, our focus, of course, is on the design portion. So when we think about design, one of the first things we want to worry about is what are the criteria for telling us our design is successful, or stated another way, what are we trying to accomplish with our design? Well, in traditional business research, the central focus of design is theory. So as a result, if we're looking at case research, really the question is, what role can case research play in theory? And one role is it can be used to propose a new theory, so that you can use a case, and it's sometimes referred to as grounded research, as a basis for arguing that current theory needs to be expanded with the introduction of some new theory that we base upon what we observed in the case study. Another role of a case study can be to expand theory. For example, we might notice that a phenomena that occurred in one context occurred in another, and that suggests the phenomena might be more general than we thought. I actually did this in a paper that I wrote about Mrs. Field's cookies and Battery March financial management. I actually used these as discussion cases in a course, and I usually had them back to back. And what surprised me was how similar the discussions of the two cases were, even though one was in financial services, a company that was one of the first automated trading companies, and the other sold cookies in malls. And what I found by researching these cases more deeply using source materials, I wasn't able to go in and observe the company, is that there were a tremendous number of parallels between the way these companies work. And so I used this to expand upon a theory of organizational learning. Another thing you can use cases for is to test theories. So if there's a particular theory out there that proposes that the world works in a particular way, you can take a case study, and you can either use that case study to demonstrate the limitations of the theory, or you can use the case study to say this confirms that the theory works in this situation. And that type of testing can be very valuable, because what the case does is it makes the theory much more concrete than perhaps the abstract reasoning would do. Finally, you can use a case study to clarify theory, which is essentially what I just said. Cases make things more concrete, and therefore may make it easier to understand what a particular theory predicts or how it might be applied in a particular situation. A rather interesting study that was published in the Academy of Management Review by Colquitt of the University of Florida and Zapata-Phelan involved looking at the different types of research that were published in top management journals over time. And what they argued was research can either focus on testing existing theory or building new theory, And it applied names to different combinations. For example, research that specifically focuses on building new theory but doesn't do any testing is a builder. Something that tests but does not do any building is a tester. And then we can have expanders who try to build new theory and test theory, and qualifiers who may be looking at the limitations of theory. And finally, things that have very little to do with theory at all, they call reporters. Now, if we actually take a look at what has happened over time, in the 1960s, there was a lot of reporting research, and indeed a lot of case studies were used and published in the research at that time. What has happened since then, however, is that virtually all the research has moved away from reporting. There's virtually no reporting research that appears in the top-tier journals in management. In fact, the top-tier journals more or less say, if you don't have theory in your research, then we're not going to publish it. And in some senses, that suggests our discipline has become more refined, and we have evolved. But on the other hand, the reporters played a very valuable role, because what they did was they gave us observations that we could use without necessarily going out into the field. And now, whenever we get observations in the context of these other objectives, they're always filtered by the objective. So if you're trying to expand theory, then you're certainly not going to discount anything in your case which supports your argument. And so we're not getting the kind of objective reporting that we might have gotten. And indeed, just about the only place you may get this type of reporting today is when you're looking at discussion cases which do not attempt to build theory because they're created for classroom use, but instead simply trying to report a context of a decision as accurately as possible. Moving on to discussion cases from research cases, when I talk about discussion cases, and I try to use the term discussion cases as opposed to teaching cases, I think of teaching cases as being more general, involving all cases that might be used in education, including discussion cases. But when I talk about discussion cases, there are three very distinct characteristics that I am referring to. The first is that the case is built around a decision. When you create a discussion case, the purpose is to stimulate discussion, and as a result, you need a focal point for the case. And the focal point is almost always a decision that needs to be made. Now, some people refer to this as a problem that needs to be solved, but it's a lot easier going into a business saying you want to look at their decisions than to go into a business and say, we want to look at your problems. So I would recommend using the term decision as opposed to problem. Second characteristic of the cases that I'm talking about is that they are authentic and based upon observation. Now, this is very much in line with my views of complexity, because in a complex environment, there may be rules, but they tend to be very localized to the situation. If you start making up your case studies, essentially if you start creating fiction instead of authentic cases, there's a very good case that you will be describing scenarios that would not actually exist in business. Now, fiction can be very engrossing, and I can see reasons for writing it. I can even see reasons for incorporating it in the classroom. But when I talk about discussion cases in my context, it's always based upon observation, and they are authentic. Finally, discussion cases are open, which is to say the cases do not have a right answer. And I think this is very important. As I've mentioned in a previous chapter, when I go into a company to write a case and I discover that they have a decision that they've already made and that there's clearly a right answer to that decision, then I immediately try to find some other decision where they really are perplexed, because as soon as you start giving a series of cases for which there are right answers, you're conveying to the participants in the discussion that when you're faced with a situation, there is going to be a right answer, and some light bulb is going to go off, and you will find it. And in a complex world, that is probably very unlikely to be the case. Another important aspect of discussion case design is what you're trying to achieve conceptually. And Herbert Simon and Alan Newell came up with a model of problem solving that they referred to as the IDC, or Intelligence Design Choice Model. And I think it's a good model for looking at the design of case studies. Case studies, when you create a good case, are going to provide you a certain intelligence, which is to say a set of facts, relationships, concepts embedded in the case that you need in order to understand the context of the decision. So it's not that a case won't give you technical information. The case will simply give you technical information in a manner that is motivated by the nature of the particular decision that needs to be made. The second element of the framework is design. You can build a lot of design into your cases, or you can build a limited amount of design. And really this most commonly deals with the specificity of the alternatives that are provided. If you're dealing with individuals who are very, very experienced in discussing cases, you may not need to provide any alternatives. All you may need to do is provide the context and the individual making the decision, and then the participants in the discussion can come up with their own alternatives. Oh yes, they should introduce another product that does X, Y, Z at price A, B, C, or whatever, and they will do the rest. I find that when I am dealing with less experienced individuals discussing cases, I will typically give them a series of alternatives to choose from, which will help them kind of structure the problem. In a lot of my undergraduate classes, one of the things we do when we analyze cases is we try to come up with kind of a table that looks at the different alternatives, or looks at how the company's changing, and look at what factors are going to be the same among alternatives and what factors are going to be different. And we use that as a way of kind of analyzing it. So the amount of design is something you control by virtue of how specific you are in terms of alternatives being considered. And then finally, of course, there is choice. And choice is a very important cognitive skill. There are a lot of folks who feel that the most important element of learning in the case method is improving judgment. And judgment obviously falls into this choice area. So even if you only have two alternatives, you can spend a lot of time trying to choose between them. Indeed, as managers will often do when the two alternatives have major consequences. So the relative balance of intelligence, design, and choice in a particular case is something that you as the case writer tend to have some control over. And for example, I'm writing a series of cybersecurity cases. In those cases, I expect I'll include quite a bit of background information because I can't be sure that my audience is expert in that. But nonetheless, there will always be choice, and in some of the cases, I will probably also basically require the students or the participants to design their own options. Moving on, another type of teaching case that's not a discussion case or a research case is one that is used primarily for the purposes of illustration. This notion of resonance that I talked about in the previous chapter, that a story is often the best way to convey an idea. And there are a lot of different types of illustration cases. One of the most common is what I would call the example case. And really the purpose of the example case is to provide something that's concrete and credible for the listener of the case. Because since this is not a discussion case, we're not necessarily going to be using it as a basis for discussion. Rather, we're using it to convey a concept. Another type of case is the showcase. And when you go into a company, there's a very good chance when you're trying to write a case that this is what they are going to want. This is essentially a story that highlights the success of something that they did. Occasionally, you will also have cases that are designed as cautionary tales, which illustrate the lack of success of something someone tried. For example, a few slides back, I talked about how the Apple executive who went to J.C. Penney tried changing the strategy and things did not end well. I was doing a case investigation for a company called Paperback Software, which created the first clone of Lotus 123, and I had to walk away from the project because Adam Osborne, the person in charge of the company, was so absolutely dead set on having a showcase written, something that could highlight the value of their products as opposed to spotlighting a particular decision that needed to be made. Another type of case is what I call a fable, and this is like a showcase, except it's constructed, it's made up, and it is often used to convey a message or moral. Why a fable as opposed to just a statement or a proverb? Well, a fable uses that storytelling mode, which is a very resonant way of communicating. Finally, we have the design case, where this is a case that actually puts forth a situation and uses it in the context of design. In the world of information systems, we often have what are called use cases. Before we build a system, we try to imagine scenarios of the system in use, and we do simulations. Well, these can be design cases. I once did a case for a court system locally where they were designing a new information system and they wanted to create some cases for training. Well, one ironic side effect is, as I created all these cases of how the system would be used, some of the folks who were potential users decided to abandon the whole project because suddenly it became clear what the project was supposed to be doing. So all of these cases can be incredibly valuable in different contexts. I do not want to suggest that they are in some way inferior to discussion cases, because they're not. They're simply used for a different purpose. A final type of case that we're looking at are the exercise cases. And really, exercise cases are designed like highly complex word problems that provide students or participants the ability to work on problems in a context that they can imagine to be more like a real-world context than, say, simply getting an equation and being asked to solve it. So there are a number of different types of exercise cases that I've seen. There is the walkthrough case. And a walkthrough case essentially is sort of a sequence case that's typically used in an instructor-facilitated discussion, and it's a way of showing people how to complete a very complicated process. So a walkthrough will normally be used for complicated problems. Here is how you deal with this type of situation when you see it in the field. And typically in a walkthrough case, there is a right answer. When I was at HBS, we had a lot of cases in the accounting area, and it always kind of frustrated me because we discussed them, but in fact, for many of these cases, there was actually a right answer, and it probably would have been more efficient to have people walk through the case, because when you had the discussion, people with answers that were not the right answer often took the floor, and everyone would be furiously taking notes about this improper solution, and unless the instructor intervened, you could easily walk away with a complete lack of understanding of the particular principle that was supposed to be conveyed in that class. Now, another example of a exercise case is a design case. And in a design case, what you basically do is you present people with a problem where they have to come up with a solution, and typically there are a lot of constraints, so you can't just imagine something. You have to come up with a design solution that fits all the constraints. And this could be an organizational design situation. It could be designed to how do we achieve this task, or it could be some physical design artifact that you might be wanting to create, depending upon the type of class. Finally, we have an assignment case, and this could be a walkthrough. It could be a design or something like a walkthrough, except it's specifically presented to individuals or groups, and they're supposed to solve it. So this is really a context-rich problem, and often if you have a walkthrough, you'll give a similar problem as an assignment once, so the students can kind of practice it. These are all, once again, good examples of cases and their effective uses of cases. And in the sciences, this is typically what they mean when they talk about case studies. But they are not discussion cases, which is the focus of informing with the case method. When I talk about case design, I'm often asked the question, well, can a case be a good research case and a good discussion case, or a good research case and a good example case? And what I would argue is that you're probably better off building each case specific to the purpose that you intend it for, but that does not mean that you cannot create a new case that incorporates the old case for some other purpose. And I think the big thing here is time. So if we look at the typical discussion case, what we're doing is we have something that provides the background context, maybe outside information, and then it stops at a decision point. And the discussion case does not take you beyond the decision point. It does not tell you what decision needs to be made. Once you've reached that decision point, and I try to write all my discussion cases while the decision is being made, there's the opportunity to expand upon it further with a number of different types of cases. For example, you can look at what happened after the decision, and that can become an example case. Typically, when you use a case as example, you don't want to leave it at the point of the decision. That's like reading a mystery novel with the last chapter taken out. Instead, what you want to do is you want to see how things turn out after the decision, and then that can be an example. Well, it also can be a source of research, because whenever you have a decision like this, in a sense, you have a quasi-experiment. You have an action that's taken and then an outcome. So the pre-K, the pre-decision period, which is covered in the discussion case, followed by the decision choice that's made, followed by the outcome, can be a useful research case because it can be used to test theories, expand theories, and so forth. This is another reason for being extremely careful and authentic when you write a discussion case, because if your discussion case is largely fictional, then it's unlikely you're going to be able to repurpose it into these other cases at some later point in time. So what are some of the key things we ought to take away from this chapter? Well, when you think about designing a case, the first and most important thing you've got to do is decide in your own mind what you want to use the case for. It's really not a good idea to go out and start writing a case without deciding if it's going to be a research case, a discussion case, an exercise, or so forth. Now, in terms of making the decision, if it's a research case, what you need to do is you need to find some relevant theory or some area where theory is completely absent, because the typical goal of a research case will be around testing, building theory. Now, if you're talking about a discussion case, what you want to focus on is a meaningful decision that needs to be made. And so it's fundamentally different in terms of a research case. The discussion case, you want to find a meaningful decision. I once went out on a case visit with a researcher who was absolutely determined to write a case that related to some theory that she was interested in, and I think that as a result, the case, which did not end up being very successful, missed some really interesting decisions that the manager simply could not wait to talk about, but basically the objective was to create a research case for her, even though she thought she was writing a discussion case. Now, when you talk about an illustration case, what you're really looking for is, a good story and a nice, clear, unambiguous outcome that results from a particular stimulus or decision or whatever. So, when you're looking for an illustration case, what you're trying to do is you're trying to find a situation that will clarify something. When you're talking about an exercise case, typically the reason we use an exercise case is because we want to give people practice in problem solving under real world constraints and context. So that's really what you're looking for in that. And then finally, you have to realize that if you do a good job researching your case, no matter what type of case it is, there's a good chance that it can be repurposed as time progresses. And so one of the things you want to do is maintain a relationship with the organization with whom you develop the case, because it opens up a lot of possibilities for the future if you can watch what happens after the case is written and see how the organization progresses.